This is Talking Foreign Policy, an internationalist perspective on Canada's role abroad. I'm Eve Engler, and today we're going to delve a little deeper into the NaziGate. As was reported, the Yaroslav Hunka's family gave $30,000 to the University of Alberta's Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which the university has returned. Today, Progress Report published a story detailing that the University of Alberta has, quote, $1.424 million in endowments and donations dedicated to 11 Waffen-SS veterans and one member of the Nazi collaborationist Ukrainian insurgent army. To discuss this, I invited a University of Lund professor, Per Anders Rudling, who's been doing work on this question for long before the Hunka NaziGate scandal in the House of Commons. And so, first of all, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And so if you could just give us a quick overview of a bit of what we know about donors to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and their connections to the Nazi military.
Well, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was set up in 1976. And it was intended originally to stimulate research on Ukrainians in Canada. It had a distinctly Canadian focus in the very beginning. Petro Savarin was one of the really foundational figures in establishing this institute. And it has been depending on community funding from the very beginning, and it's been integrated with the University of Alberta since a few years back. It has been depending on funding. And of course, the funding comes from a number of figures, from people with certain political orientations, social groups, religious groups, people interested in folklore, religious studies, and so on. And of course, figures rooted in various wings of the Ukrainian nationalist organizations in Canada.
And so you mentioned Peter Savarin. He was actually somebody who, alongside Hunka, was part of the 14th Waffen-SS. So he I guess pledged the oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler, and he was one of the founders. Can you talk a little bit more about some of these other the SS figures who've donated? I know, or who have endowments based on them. I know. Volodymyr Kubachovic is one of the players. I think he's like a $500,000 endowment for him, and he has even higher kind of echelon of SS background.
Well, Volodymyr Kubachovic, I mean, Hunka was born in 1925. He was 18 or 19 when he enlisted or volunteered in the Waffen-SS. It's hard to ascertain exactly what he did. The Canadian archives are not accessible. The Rimini list, a list of 7,100 Waffen-SS volunteers, is still withheld. The Rodal report, second part of the Defense Commission, which went through alleged war criminality, is also not available. So it's hard for me to comment on exactly for someone like Hunka did. But some of the people are more known than others. I would say Hunka would probably be small fry. He was young when he joined, and I think it's a good thing to point out that the Holocaust in Galicia or Halychina, that part of Ukraine, was essentially carried out in 1941-42. At the time the unit was established in 1943, by and large, the Jews of Galicia or Halychina were dead. So it's unlikely that Hunka or Savarin were involved in these sort of atrocities, right? They were young at the time. But Volodymyr Kubachovic, I think, is an entire different kettle of fish. He was in the Third Reich. He was the director of something known as the Ukrainian Central Committee, which was sort of an outfit set up by the German authorities in this region known as the General Government, or the general government or general gouvernement, which was set up in 1939, 1940. And Kubiovich was then leading this Ukrainian Central Committee. Did not have much direct power, but they had influence in how to administer local dairies and farmsteads and whatnot, and some influence on schooling and so on. And he was one of those people who set up the Waffen-SS Halichina. He took the initiative with Hans Frank, and he was also placed rather centrally and corresponded and met with Hans Frank many times on events like Hitler's birthday on the 20th of April, which was a big sort of celebratory gathering. He was a geographer and quite an accomplished scientist at that. He was not a bad geographer, but he was also belonging to the more conservative wing of the, well, he was not formally a member, but he was leaning towards the more conservative wing of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. That is the leading far-right organization. He belonged to leaning towards the Melnik wing. And he was also trying to move forward Ukrainian positions. And in that regard, he was, of course, acutely aware of the Holocaust, and in his correspondence with Hans Frank and in his activities, he petitioned Hans Frank and the German administrators to get Jewish property transferred to Ukrainians, with the argument that Ukrainians had ample of experience of Jewish exploitation, and therefore it's only fair that now when the Jews are being removed, that they should have a fair share of the loot. So after the war, well, at the end of the war, he evacuated, I believe, to Vienna, and then from there to Sarcelles in France. And he was one of the initiators and reorganizers of the so-called Shevchenko Scientific Society, which was sort of a Ukrainian academy in exile. And in 1976, in 1960s, he edited this Encyclopedia of Ukraine, Encyclopedia Ukrainian Znavstvo, the Encyclopedia of Ukrainian Studies, and then it was developed translated into English in a multi-volume edition. I think the first volume was paid for by the province of Saskatchewan. I believe the second one by Alberta. I can't remember, but it was sort of an enterprise between multicultural funding from Canada, University of Toronto Press, and Kubiovich, of course, was the editor of this work. A significant feat, I would say. I mean, like, some parts of it is still very current and it's very informative and well done in some ways. On the other hand, of course, it lacks an entry, for instance, on the Holocaust. When you look up atrocities during World War II, if you're looking up the biographies of some of these people, you get a very sort of retouched or airbrushed picture. So you have a figure like that who was leading collaborator, initiator of the Waffen-SS Halichina, and then after the war for many years, he was also able to shape the image of these organizations and to shape the memory. And he lived a very long life. He died outside of Paris in 1985, and of course his endowments were donated to a large extent to the University of Alberta. So you have a situation here where you have activism, idealism, political activity, and collaborationism going hand in hand, and where a number of very acute issues, as I see it, have not been treated properly as objects of inquiry. The Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies have not particularly been very interested in really digging deeper into these people's past. And, you know, when I've tried to raise those issues about the legacy of some of these figures, I've been met with, you know, indifference or hostility, you know, ad hominem responses.
And on their website, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies says, quote, until its completion 17 years later, the encyclopedia was the Institute's major priority, absorbing an enormous amount of staff resources and a third of the annual budget. Right, so here you have this prominent Waffen-SS figure, Kubakovich, who's editing this, and so they're like right in the middle of this process. And you mentioned, you know, Alberta and Saskatchewan actually funding English translation. So, like, how does this kind of fit into, like, sort of, you know, Ukrainian nationalism? And then also during his speech to the House of Commons 10 days ago, Zelensky says that he talks about how the first monument to the Holodomor was in Edmonton, and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies says on the website, they boast on the website that in 1982-83, They're the ones who did a big campaign around the famine, and they unveiled the monument at City Hall in Alberta. So Zelensky's saying this is the first monument to the Holodomor anywhere in the world. This comes out of this Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies that has, you know, a former SS guy who's one of the founders and has all these sort of ties. So, like, you know, yeah, how does this fit within sort of creating a certain type of Ukrainian nationalism? Obviously, at that point, was very anti-USSR. Now, obviously, today, I think that's, you know, sort of continued. There's an anti-Russia kind of element to it, and it's gotten caught into a whole big, you know, NATO geopolitics and the war. But yeah, sort of what's its role in sort of Ukrainian nationalism and undermining the USSR, etc.
Well, I think first, what should be recognized first, and that should be stated very clearly, was that the famine in Ukraine was denied altogether up until 1987, when the Ukrainian SSR recognized it. Historical demographers today, the best studies, in my opinion, is by the French demographer Jacques Vallin. He and his team in 2002 established that there was an excess mortality in the Ukrainian SSR, that is, in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, of 2.6 million people. A Ukrainian study and a few others Ukrainian studies came up with higher numbers up to 3.9 million people, excess mortality. So a reasonable estimate is that the excess mortality in the Ukrainian SSR would probably be around 3.3, 3.5, a little bit lower, a little bit higher, give and take. This, of course, well, I should say also the famine affected, of course, the Kubani area east of Ukraine, the Western Siberia, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan, of course. So there are a number of regions really hit by this very brutal Stalinist collectivization, which was carried out as a way to liquidate the kulaks, the self-owning peasants as a class. It was aimed at breaking the social segment. Ukraine was very, very badly hit. And I think it's safe to say today that the famine of 1932-33 constituted Stalin's single greatest crime against his own people. There's no doubt about this. And this not a consensus exactly about numbers, but this was a horrific crime of a magnitude that should be recognized, should be studied, and the victims should be remembered. I think that's very important to remember. That said, the term Holodomor was introduced roughly around this time, in about around 1983, 1984. And the term Holodomor, a term that starts on holo, and came as a regularly with the number 7 million or 10 million. Is not by chance, it's not random. This came out of an increased awareness of the Holocaust. The Holocaust had also not been studied much, right? You know, it was not really until the Eichmann trial in 1961, and then the Auschwitz trials and the Frankfurt trials in 1963, and the Six-Day War in Israel and whatnot. But really, the Holocaust became an everyday item to the Canadian public, to the American public, to the Swedish public, with the NBC miniseries, The Holocaust, which brought this in a televised form into every Canadian, every American, every Western German and Swedish living room. So the Holocaust was established. And roughly around the same time in 1978, 79, the FBI established the Office of Special Investigations. That was a unit in the United States to look after alleged war criminals, right? Track them down, denaturalize them, deport them, because of this interest now in alleged war criminals coming to the United States in particular. And it's, of course, many of these people that were pursued by the authorities were not Germans, because relatively few German Nazis came to the United States, but many of these people were Croatians, Balts, Western Ukrainians. And not least in this TV series, this miniseries, The Holocaust, Ukrainians figured as perpetrators, something that stung the Ukrainian diaspora. So the choice of using the term Holodomor and to emphasize that the famine was a Soviet genocide aimed to exterminate Ukrainians as a nation, and to choose the number 7 million was anything but. Neither terminology, nomenclature, numbers were random. So when the monument was opened in Edmonton in 1983, this was indeed the first major memorial to the famine. I don't believe they used the term Holodomor in this memorial. I believe the genocide, famine, or whatnot. The term came a little bit later on. So I think this whole discourse, recognizing the horrific nature of this Stalin's greatest crime against some people, at the same time, one also has to be able to look at this narration, which is selective and incomplete. And of course, there is this aspect that the driving force in this were Ukrainian nationalists, and from not from Soviet Ukraine, the Ukrainian SSR, which were affected, right? These were people that came, like Peter Saverin, who came, they were Polish citizens, right? They came from that part of Poland, which before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, well, they were Poles. They never really put a foot in Soviet Ukraine, many of them, right? So they are presenting themselves as victims of this famine, which took place in a different country, which they couldn't really cross over into. That doesn't make it any less horrific, but there's a paradox here that the initiative for this came from Peter Saverin, who was a volunteer in the Waffen-SS, was then active as a genocide education activist, trying to spread information, make what they call it awareness about genocide. So there's a paradox in that I think is quite eerie, because if you're interested in Ukrainian history, if you're interested in that part of Ukraine where these immigrants actually came from, what they have there, a city like Lviv had in 1935 about 9 or 8% Ukrainians, but the Jewish component was, if I'm not entirely mistaken, 35%. 50% were Poles, and you had relations like this. That's the way it looked in Minsk and in Tarnopol, in Ivano-Frankivsk and Stanislav then. So you have here cities that where the Jewish components were wiped out, the Poles were deported. You had ethnic cleansing of the Polish minority in Volhynia and also in Halychina. So if you look at these regions where they actually came from, if there was a genocidal event there, it was the Holocaust, and it was expulsion of the Poles. That is not to sell the Stalinist horrors, which were much larger, short, but there is an eerie instrumentalization of history, which, when it comes from institutions that are affiliated with academic institutions and universities, I think have been less than candid. And there's been a great reluctance to address the issue of the OUN and UPA's ethnic cleansing of Poles, the pogroms in 1941, and of course, not only the legacy of the Waffen-SS Halychina, well, which we cannot, the Rimner list, as I said, the Rimner list, the Rudling report are unavailable. We cannot really study this history. So there's a silence and uncomfortability with these issues, at the same time as a strong focus on the Soviet system as genocidal and turning the famine into an ethnic genocide, aiming at exterminating the Ukrainian nation. And there I have, as a scholar, a problem. Yeah, one should be able to treat both these crimes as objects of inquiry, but also the discourses surrounding them. And here I think that you have multiple fellowships after Waffen-SS collaborators, including somebody like Kubiovich, where you have $500,000. I tried to raise this several times. I wrote an article about this. I tried to, I spoke to the deputy director of the CIUS about this in 2005. I wrote an article about this academically in 2011, 2012. I've wrote a more publicistic op-ed in 2015 about, among other things, Kubiovich. And the response was that, from the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, that I'm assaulting the dead and that I'm dragging the good name of my alma mater, University of Alberta, in the mud. And actually, the very opposite is the case. I am a proud alumni of University of Alberta, and I'm very much dependent on that good name. And that good name for me has opened many doors. I worked in Singapore, I worked in Austria, I worked in Norway. I'm now a tenured faculty member here in Lund, and I'm very proud of the doors that University of Alberta opened. But I also am disturbed by the unwillingness to address this. And when it happens, it is after a scandal, because the reason I raised these issues was that if the Russians find out about this, we are serving them a propaganda victory on a silver platter. It's the penalty shot for Putin. Here you have a university that hasn't dealt with its past, and when Canada applauds a Waffen-SS veteran, well, then the soil is burning under their feet. Then they do away with a Hunka fellowship, which was $30,000. But then there's another dozen of them that were not addressed. And I think in order to, among other things, address the Ukrainian famine or the Soviet famine openly, candidly, and addressing these horrors, you also need to clean your own closets. You can't just ignore these. And the whole idea of Waffen-SS volunteers in the role of genocide awareness educators, to me, is discordant and does not sound right. It's objectionable for a number of reasons, not least academically.
Yeah, to say on a personal level, I'm a bit embarrassed because I wasn't aware of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies role in sort of whitewashing Nazi crimes, even though I published a book called A Propaganda System, where I look at a bunch of the different universities. I look at how the military funds security studies. I look at the Munk School of Global Affairs was set up by Peter Munk, the founder of Barrick Gold, big mining company. The only example I can think of that's close would be the Israel studies at Concordia University, where it was David Azrieli who had actually fought in the Haganah in 1947-48 in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, where he set up an Israel studies at Concordia explicitly as sort of a pushback against pro-Palestinian activism at Concordia. But clearly, to my mind, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, it seems like its sort of role in whitewashing crimes of the Waffen-SS is a pretty direct correlation between some of the people involved in setting it up, financing it, and then framing that. And also, I should also say that the Institute talks about receiving $2.2 million in the early 1990s from the Canadian International Development Agency for work in Ukraine in terms of what they call it, assisting senior policymakers in introducing legislative reform. So clearly, they've played quite a role in Ukraine, even in post-independence Ukraine, in terms of I think pushing a fairly sort of a nationalistic kind of outlook, which you can understand in the context of Russia aggression, Russia belligerence, but also when it's connected to this sort of very unsavory history on the other side is more complicated morally. Any further comments on the Institute and sort of fitting in, maybe even bringing up into today with like some of the geopolitical context in the Russian war and NATO proxy war?
Well, I should probably say that I am not sure I agree with that they're whitewashing the Waffen-SS. I mean, what they've done regarding these issues, for most part, they have not been actively whitewashing. They have been avoiding certain issues, right? Petro Savarin was an important figure in the establishment of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and as such, I don't think his Waffen-SS membership was known to the university. It was well known in the Ukrainian community, where it was a source of pride. He did inaugurate and did fundraising for this Waffen-SS memorial set up in 1976, and he did hold the inaugural speech, right? And for the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Brody, which took place in 1944, and which destroyed the sort of Galician Ukrainian division in its first incarnation. Then it was reconstructed from various police formations in 1944. When the 40th anniversary of that was held, a commemoration for the Waffen-SS veterans in St. Catharines in Ontario, he was the speaker. And of course, what he said there is almost like one-to-one, very, very similar to, in spirit, to what Anthony Rota said about Hunka, right? That these are heroes, these are Spartans, Thermopoleans, they have been fighting against our eternal enemy of Ukraine, that is the Russians, and so on. That Bandera, Shukhevich, and all this whole tradition is a very glorious one, right? So he was having this political activism as a senior member of the Waffen-SS Veteran Society, and then he had his Canadian side, the English or French mainstream side, where he served in these committees, and actually did also, I should say, should be recognized for having. He was a very able organizer, and he was a fundraiser, and as political operator. I mean, the progressive conservatives, whatever you say about politics, right and left, they did some good things too. I mean, the way with the sterilization laws in Alberta and whatnot. So what he did when he joined the Waffen-SS, he was 17 or 18 years old, and was 1 year of his life. So I think that picture should be recognized, right? Not everybody that joins, say, works for the KGB, or everyone works for the Waffen-SS are monsters, right? I met Savarin a couple of times, and to me, he was, always struck me as a very jolly, friendly, likable figure. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that people can, under different circumstances, develop in different directions. But so the CAOS did not whitewash the Holocaust. They did not whitewash the Waffen-SS Halichina. But what they did, for instance, was when there was debate about the leader of the more radical wing of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, when a colleague of mine, actually my doctoral supervisor, wrote an op-ed in the Edmonton Journal when, after Ukraine had turned Stepan Bandera into a national hero, he said, well, this is problematic because this figure was associated with massacres of up to 4,000 Jews during the pogroms 1941. Then the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Zenon Kahut, who then led the institution, he wrote a rebuttal saying this is not correct, they're not fascist, this is very much debated, and so on. And he signed as director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. So there he directly sought to undermine awareness raising about the pogroms, and you know, about from somebody like my doctor supervisor who actually knows this very well. So there were elements of whitewashing, yes, but mostly downplaying and then upplaying other events to use human suffering and political atrocities instrumentally, and there I have a problem. That said, the CIOS also have done good things. They have also supported good research. They have not only done this, but this has been a part of the legacy, which to me has been quite disturbing as somebody working on the Holocaust in Ukraine. I mean, I think I first became aware of this when I was as a fresh PhD student in Canada. There was a CIOS event located at the Roman Shulkevich Youth Complex in Edmonton, where they showed this very anti-Soviet movie, The Soviet Story by Edmund Snorre, and it was marketed by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And I came there, and it was the first time I really saw this oversized bust of Roman Shulkevich. And so, like, and I was, well, isn't that the person who volunteered to serve in the Schutzmannschaften, who led the Nachtigall unit in Lviv, and who was the commander of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which killed up to 90,000 Polish civilians. And this was sort of uncontroversial. And to me, this sort of discordant, because Canada, and well, as you might hear from my accent and guess, I'm a native of Sweden, and Canada and Sweden are in many ways quite similar societies. You know, there's some difference, but many things, hockey, cultural references and whatnot, they're quite similar. So this to me a little bit discordant to have this, right? And I think that's, as you mentioned here, that there are various groups sponsoring various politicized academic foundations. I think that there is something that in Canadian normative multiculturalism that I think deserves to be problematized. Any society, as long as the Swedes have been drinking coffee and reading Martin Luther's translation of the Bible, or had the Social Democrats, we have been multicultural, right? But multiculturalism as a political system in which various ethnic communities are getting government support for various political activities, but various communities in turn then set up ethnicized academic institutions, Croat studies, Ukrainian studies, and so on, and study essentially a territory like Ukraine, which is profoundly, you know, per excellence, a border territory. This was a homeland of the Ashkenazi Jewry. This is a heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry. This was a territory with large Polish minorities. There were and are Armenians there, certainly Russians, Bulgarians, even a few Swedish villages, right, in southern Ukraine, Mennonites and whatnot, right? So when an institute focus on Ukrainian history and do history that way, you often have an ethnicized history which does not account for the multiplicity and the plurality of this. So there is a problem here, I think, or something to be problematized when you have a sort of a multiculturalist, which means there's money here to the Druze community, to the Serbian community, to the Latvian community, to the Ukrainian community. And of course, then who are those people and who speaks for them? Because you have the Ukrainian Canadian Congress very much likes to emphasize they speak on behalf of 1.4 million Canadians of Ukrainian descent, and they go by the census there. But of course, you can have multi-ethnic, you can have multi-entries in the Canadian censuses. You can be, you know, if you're a fifth generation, you can be Mennonite, German, Swedish, Algerian, and Ukrainian, right? And then you're partly Ukrainian, and suddenly you end up in this category where you have a group that claim to speak on behalf of Ukrainian issues. And this Ukrainian Canadian Congress was for a number of years run by people affiliated with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. They've been pushing for, you know, they set up task forces to go after researchers that tarnish the honor of the Ukrainian national, you know, national heritage and so on, right? So there's a problem here with what they say, you know, in English they say, well, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So those people that are more ethnic than thou, you know, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress perhaps represent a few tens of thousands, most of it which churches, but perhaps a few thousand political activists of nationalist persuasion claiming to speak on behalf of 1.4 million people. And of course, most of those 1.4 million people are partial Ukrainian descent, are as Canadian as anybody else. I would imagine they're like hockey night in Canada and pickup trucks or Schneider train and I don't know, Molson beer or whatever is Canadian. I don't know, you know. And they're probably not very interested in the Waffen-SS Galizien or in Shukhevich or in this stuff. But you have this sort of, in a way, this part of this multiculturalism as a system, this normative multiculturalism has aspects of multinationalism, a problematization here that, you know, and one part of this is that to have the Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and they're coming from a territory like Lviv, as I said, the Ukrainians were a small minority. They dominated in the countryside, but the plight of the Jews, the Holocaust in Lviv, there's been next to zero interest in that. The pogroms in Lviv, zero interest from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Dealing with ethnic cleansing of the Poles, nothing. Critical inquiry of the Waffen-SS Halichina, zero. So there's a problem in this, and I don't know how to put my finger on it, but this part of a larger. I think we need to rethink, not only make the archives available, but also how we structure ethnic communities and how a progressive, open, liberal, lowercase l, liberal democratic society like Canada and Sweden are managing an increasingly diverse society. And often, you know, the intention here was if you sponsor Ukrainian or Druze or Serbian or Dutch activities, you produce good Canadians. But often some of these people have had an outright, almost a separatist agenda in that regard, that they took this money and they pursued a memory politics. For instance, building a monument to Roman Shukhevich. From Canadian liberal multicultural money goes into constructing a memorial to somebody who was an architect, an active executor of ethnic cleansing. That to me is highly paradoxical.
But it's to me, it's the geopolitics aligning with multiculturalism, in the sense that the Canadian government will not fund Russian, there's 200,000 people of Russian descent or more in Canada. They're not going to fund Russian organizations that are pro-Putin, right? They're willing to fund and enable those who align with NATO's perspective. And clearly, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was part of a process of trying to weaken the Soviet Union, and then that Canada was a big enabler of and a big proponent of, and simultaneously post-independence, obviously the Canadian government has spent tens and tens of millions of dollars in promoting civil society within Ukraine that is sort of anti-Russia, from the Orange Revolution to undermining Yanukovych. There's a whole process of Canada taking one side within Ukraine, and so they're willing to sort of like turn a blind eye to the that, to me, what NaziGate was about in House of Commons was that the Speaker of the Parliament wanted to celebrate someone who killed Russians during World War II. He was very clear about that. And even in his apology afterwards, he said, he basically justified it all by, I just wanted to celebrate someone who killed Russians. Well, the Nazis killed, more than 10 million Russians during World War II. Trudeau apologized to everyone, who was victimized with the Nazis, except for Russians. And so to me, the multiculturalism here is being, instrumentalized by the objectives of NATO, objectives of Ottawa's alignment with the U.S. empire, and a sort of broader geopolitical objectives. That's not to justify what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but it is to put a context. And certainly, when there's all this complaints about Russia, let's say in 2010, 20, whatever, supporting Yanukovych, Russia's intervening in Ukraine. Well, a country that's 10,000 kilometers away that's intervening has much less of a security concern than a country that's right on the border. So that to me is kind of part of the understanding the broader picture of how the Institute has sort of been kind of mobilized around the geopolitical objectives of NATO.
Well, yes and no. I mean, like, part of this I disagree with, but some things, in that sense, there is this idea that there was, of course, also the Association for the United Ukrainian Canadians. There was a pro-communist, leftist Ukrainian organization, and it still exists. And of course, the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, later the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, was set up in 1940 in order to, to ally itself with the nationalist Ukrainians, because they were also concerned about nationalist Ukrainians, because they were at the time, 1940, leaning towards Hitler, right? So it was a way to get control of that. But yes and no. I mean, like, so they have supported Ukrainian Canadian Congress. That they have not really supported the Ukrainian communists in that sense. And I don't know if they're supporting Russian groups today. The Russian immigrants are a more recent community, and of course, some of these Russian groups in Toronto and not, which gather with the Russian flags and promote Ruski Mir and defend Putin, I don't think they should have any money, And I think the Russian aggression in Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable. And it's a war crime. And personally, I very much support Ukraine's right to make the decisions they want, just as support Sweden's right to make the foreign policy decisions they want, right? We have to remember this war started in 2022, but in December, Putin met with a number of ambassadors. Then he wrote this infamous declaration that he aimed to the Americans, saying here, like, you have to stop the further enlargement of NATO. You cannot take any new members. And that he singled out Sweden and Finland as not being allowed to join NATO. So essentially, Putin told Sweden and Finland, you do not have the right to be actors in the international arena. You cannot make the foreign policy decisions you want. Then Putin started the war of aggression. So I very strongly support Ukraine. That's my position. I support Ukraine. I think if Ukraine were to join NATO, they should have the right to do so. Of course, pending that other states agree with that. Sweden wants to join NATO, but we're held up by two authoritarian states. But yes, there is, of course, here a legitimate means to support Ukraine. I do support Ukraine. That said, and I am in favor of sending Ukraine weapons and the equipment that it needs to defend itself. That said, there is also what you mentioned. You're right about that they also supported one certain narration of history, or at least have been uncritical of this sort of like relativization of certain issues. I mean, as in the case of the most egregious case, when Yushchenko, the president of the Orange Revolution, as he left office, made Bandera a national hero. I was opposed to this, not just because the man was an anti-Semite and a totalitarian and his groups killed Jews, but it was also harmful for Ukraine, because Ukraine is an imperfect, perhaps, but an aspiring democracy. And I would like to see, I would like to see a democratic Ukraine, and I would like to see critical discussion about history. And so, geopolitics aside and whatnot, right? I don't share all the interpretations there, but I think here, what you mentioned here also about support in Israeli groups and Palestinian groups and whatnot, I think it's indicative, yes, of the problem of how do you manage a multi-ethnic, multinational society in that way, right? In the US, they rejected multiculturalism. The idea here was e pluribus unum. You should overcome diversion and have a melting pot. There are problems with that too. And the opponents of multiculturalism are also, in some cases, very right-wing people, who also are problematic in their own right. And also the people that are multiculturalists and of the Pierre Trudeau kind, I don't think necessarily they were vicious, but the outcome was paradoxical. And the outcome of this, we've seen this scandal coming around and biting Canada in the rear. This is, of course, the optics of this are disastrous. But of course, what Anthony Rota said about Hunka, yeah, I mean, go figure, a 98-year-old fighting on the Eastern Front, what are the options there? Well, he would either be Waffen-SS or he would be UNOPA. That would be the two options. They didn't take too many Soviet partisans into this country, and I don't know if that was so vicious. I mean, it's just the results was disastrous. But I think the guy probably had no clue about history. I mean, Canada was allied with the USSR, so when they were fighting the Russians, they were fighting Canadians' allies. And at a time as they were fighting the Soviets, and there are good reasons for somebody like Hunka, who lived through the Soviet occupation as a child and saw the Stalinist brutality of the occupation 39 to 41, to be very much opposed to the Stalinists. No doubt about that. But as he was holding the Red Army back, then, the extermination of the remaining Jews continued in Majdanek. The trains were going to Auschwitz, and when he was fighting the advancing Red Army, there was a debate about this in Germany. You might be familiar with this historische Streit, this battle of historians in 1986. It was a big argument. How can we deal with the past? And Jürgen Habermas, one famous historian there said that, well, we should be proud of some of our German heroes, those who fought the invasion. So those, once the Red Army started coming into East Prussia, to Königsberg and to whatnot, those who fought them, they were heroes because they defended their families and their homeland. And then Habermas said, well, no, they were not, because they were fighting, yes, the invading Red Army, but at the same time, they defended a criminal regime which were exterminating people en masse. And in that sense, these people who volunteered for Hitler, they could not have been unaware what happened to the Jews. They came from cities where the Jews, in the cities there were more Jews than Ukrainians in most cities in Western Ukraine, and the Jews are suddenly gone. You then take an oath, not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler personally. You get your blood group tattoo on your left arm, and you pledge allegiance directly to Adolf Hitler. You get training. The NCOs were trained in Dachau, in connected with Dachau concentration camp, right? They could not have seen what was going on, even if you were 18 or 19 years old. And in the case of Volodymyr Kobyovich, he not only knew about this, he lobbied that Aryanization money should go to Ukrainians. So these episodes, I mean, here's bottom line here. Before, and I think it's important to commemorate the Ukrainian famine, but before they build memorials to the Holodomor, the genocide of Ukrainians, they could clean up in front of their own door first. And I think that is what irked me. And one does not exclude the other. There is this fantastic book that came out a few years ago of Michael Rothberg called Multi-Directional Memory. And he argues that awareness of the Holocaust should not stand in opposition to, say, awareness of the Armenian genocide, but awareness of the Holocaust could also inform human rights movements for civil liberties in other parts of the world, can also help us understand and be empathetic to the Armenian case, or for that matter, the Ukrainian famine, right? So this instrumental use of this, of human tragedy for political purposes, not least when initiated by people who took an oath to Adolf Hitler, I think deserves to be treated as an object of inquiry. It should have been done 20 years ago. As I said, I raised this issue the first time in 2005. My op-ed from 2015 about Kobyovich is available online on History News Network. You can just Googling away. So, but the response then was that, I'm assaulting the dead. I'm assaulting Kobyovich, and I'm dragging my alma mater's good name in the dirt. Well, in my opinion, what drags my alma mater's good name in the dirt is the inability to address this. Memorials, endowments, veneration of these collaborators. That is harming the University of Alberta, not critical inquiry by professionally trained historians. That's my 2 cents on this.
And right now, with the University of Alberta being asked about this regularly in the media, you have clearly been shown to be right. If they would have got ahead of this, this is turning into actually a PR disaster for the University of Alberta, and I don't think they have a solution to get out of their mess. But
well, no, I mean, the solution, they do have a solution. They addressed this openly, candidly, and frankly. What happened, because I've been following this for many years, they went in and scrubbed their website. So this list of endowments was removed. But of course, it's a wayward archive, and you can find it Googling away. It's not very hard. But I mean, so and on social media, I'm avoiding social media. I spent a couple of years in Singapore, and I learned, to stay away from social media. So I very seldom comment, but I did for once, and I did comment on this. And then you have a former employee of the CIUS saying, like, well, how is the university supposed to vet all those people? How is this possible? And I said, well, I can do this from my living room in Sweden, by it's Googling away. But, so at the same time, they claim, how are we supposed to do this? And then the University of Alberta removes the list of the Nazi donors or Nazi collaborative donors. Another of these activists say, well, go and read the Defense Commission. Well, I would love to read it, particularly part 2, which the Canadian government withholds from me. I would love to read this. So on the one hand, go do your homework, read the sources. We don't give you the sources. We can't vet them. And it removed the tools and the materials that we need to vet them. But I could do this. I'm a research leader here. I can get a TA, and my TA will be very happy, for a couple of $1,000, do 2 or 3 weeks. Just dig through this. You can do this online, a lot of this. So, but anyway, these 12 Waffen-SS fellowships that I uncovered, it took me, I just revisited this, and once this story broke, I revisited this record through this wayward machine, and I found another 6 Waffen-SS endowments. So it's not hard to do. You need just to break the codes, because these Waffen-SS veterans, they operated, of course, under euphemism. They didn't call themselves the Waffen-SS Veterans Friendship Association or whatnot, right? They called themselves the veterans of the Brotherhood of the 1st Ukrainian Division of the Ukrainian National Army. And I would imagine, I don't know, I mean, I'm just guessing here, but I don't think Roda, the speaker, just came up with this. I would imagine he has been in long contact with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. This is the narrative they've been repeating year in and year out. They've been saluting the Waffen-SS veterans on Remembrance Day, November 11th. Yeah. And this idea that they were Canadian heroes, Ukrainian heroes, this is part of the subculture in the Ukrainian Canadian nationalist diaspora. So, you know, I would imagine something like this happened, that somebody said, well, look here, we have one Zelensky's here. We have a big hero who fought the Russians. Oh, good. Well, who is he? Well, he fought the Russians and in these years. Okay. And he is a hero. And he uncritically bought this. And this is a narration which the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, funded by Canadian taxpayers, have been disseminated for years, right? They get subsidies, they get tax-exempt status. Some of these more radical nationalist groups, they send out this sort of quasi-denialist narration with reduced postage, tax-exempt status and whatnot, right? The memorials to Shukhevich was paid for by taxpayers. So, and it should be addressed. And just as I'm saying this, I'm not anti-Ukrainian and I'm not anti-Canadian. You know, I love Ukraine. I love so many things about Ukrainian language, culture, and whatnot. I would not bother to learn Ukrainian language unless I appreciated it. And I like Canada very much. It's not anti-Canadian either. You know, this is what I do as an historian. This is my job. And I would not have liked this to have happened. You know, had they addressed this long time ago, had Humka or whoever, Krista Friedland, whoever were in charge of this, actually consulted with historians, and not, as the Canadian government has repeatedly done. Stephen Harper said so, and you know, this has been the long-standing affair that we are consulting the Ukrainian Canadian Congress for their expertise on historical matters. I don't think that's a good idea. And now I think the reason to think again about the utility of doing this, because there are critical historians that do write critically about this, that can be consulted.
Well, thanks for your work on this, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me today. Per Anders Rudling, University of Lund. Also, I should mention you are the author of The Rise and Fall of Belarusian Nationalism, 1906-1931. And yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care.